Okay, the idea of a hypothesis test. Now let's say somebody comes in and says, Josh is a terrible teacher, right? Now that's a hypothesis, right? That's something that they want to try to convince people is true. So how could they do that following the theme of our statistical course here? Well, what they could do is, in one sense, they could start off and say, well, here's the null hypothesis, h sub 0. And the null hypothesis would be the baseline, right? Josh is a good teacher. And presumably they would want to try to balance this against an alternative. And the alternative would be, of course, h of a, and let's go up here so I can keep these together. H sub a, the alternative, would be Josh is not a good teacher. So now, how could they do this in the second stage, right? Well, if they wanted to try to do this, they would have to try to provide some evidence. So what they might say is, well, he never grades our homework on time. He responds to emails too late. He grades us too harshly. And he expects too much work. Right? So that would be the evidence that would be lied against or being given against me to try to say that I am not a good teacher. So notice my null hypothesis is that I am a good teacher right here, and the evidence that is provided is trying to give evidence of the alternative. I'm trying to prove the alternative. Okay, so in stage 3, after all the evidence has been laid out in front of the jury, what is the jury supposed to do? Well, the jury goes and deliberates. And if we accept the way that trials are supposed to run here, they go and they assume innocence. Right? They assume the null hypothesis, and they try to ask themselves, if it were true that Josh is a good teacher, what is the probability that he never grades homework, responds late, grades harshly, and expects too much? So that's the question the jury is going to have to ask themselves, is if he were actually a good teacher, and this person's trying to convince me that I'm not, then they would go consider these questions, right? If it were true, if the null hypothesis were true, what is the probability that these things would happen, right? And they try to see, is it reasonable or is it not reasonable? And typically in a jury, it's beyond reasonable doubt is the level. So after they've chosen the probability, their only job left is to come back and make a conclusion. And the conclusion could be one of two things, really. Right? Conclusion number A is they might say, well, the evidence was strong enough. Evidence was strong. In other words, if I were a good teacher, the probability that these other things would happen would be extremely low. Good teachers don't do those with much high percentage. So we would expect, or that would sort of give evidence that the evidence was strong. So if the evidence were strong, we would reject the H naught, and we would have evidence of the alternative. In other words, we think that Josh is not a good teacher. On the other hand, what I think is more likely is that what we would find here is that the evidence might not be strong. I'm a little biased, of course, though. But if the evidence was not strong, what would the conclusion be? Well, then you would fail to reject the null. And we would not have strong evidence of the alternative. In other words, it's not that we prove Josh is a good teacher. What we do is we fail to see that Josh is a bad teacher. Just like in a trial, you cannot prove your null hypothesis. You cannot find someone innocent. All you can do is find them guilty. That would be option A, because the probability was just too low. Or maybe the evidence was reasonable. Maybe Josh got sick or something like that. And so in that case, you don't find him innocent. You say he is not guilty. You find him not guilty. You never prove anyone innocent. You either prove them guilty or you prove them not guilty. And that's the philosophy of the hypothesis test.